Welcome back. Today we are going to take a look at the one known as Phoenixcall. So this one, of course, is done by Celest, which is a sub-brand of Kinera. So this one is known as Kinera Celest Phoenixcall, and it does come in a super attractive, sturdy box. And inside the box, we also get a Phoenix accessory, charm, keychain. I'm not sure what they actually call it. Underneath the cable here, I think there's nothing there other than the case, which is actually to the right. Yeah, so nothing else in the case, but I think if you've been following this one for a little bit, you will know that this is possibly the most photogenic set that's been released in a long time. This is the blue version, or the blue-red version, so not quite as photogenic as the clear version. But yeah, it is absolutely stunning to look at and to hold, and if that is your primary reason for purchasing it, I really can't argue with that. It is very, very attractive and nice to hold and to look at. So certainly a valid reason to pick it up. Also, you get the blue and pink or red cable, which is very nice and very much in line with other Kinera upgrade cables. It is a very nice piece of cable done quite well. So that is what's in the box. We'll kind of slide this out of the way. You also do get a case that is here, so kind of a blue round zipper case, which is pretty cool. So we'll kind of jump into it kind of right away with some pros and cons. And I'll say that kind of right off the bat, who is this one targeting? It has a very safe, warm, smooth playback. I think that actually works, general appealing. It actually works out pretty well. As I just talked about, the cable, the box, the shells, everything is super nice to look at and to hold, and very professionally done for the retail price, which I think is $129. So all that is done quite well. This one also does feature a 7mm dynamic driver, and if those of you who have played around with micro dynamic drivers, they sort of range from non-impactful to not quite enough to pretty good, and this one actually ends up being on the pretty good side. I think it does have the impact that you're not really going to miss all that much from a 10mm. It just takes a little bit of volume to get there, but this one isn't as soft and unimpactful as some other micro dynamic drivers. On the con side, I do think it's a borderline a little bit too warm. It's a little bit too safe. It's not really pushed at all. It just has this warm, smooth signature to it. And I think it does struggle with the Adele test. And I think that's where we're going to go through this one kind of quickly. And I think this is what people are going to remember about this set is I think vocals are just slightly off where they should be. I think somewhere between the mids and the treble, I think there's something that's a bit off, and I think it's hard to get past that at the price range that they're selling it. And I think Vesper 2 sort of took a similar path. I think the signature targets a specific people who like a warm, smooth playback, and I think that will actually fit in well with them. If you're trying to figure out which hybrid that you're going to look at, maybe EM6L, 7 Hertz Sonos, Fudu by Tangzu. I think those tended to do vocals probably a little bit better, maybe a little bit more natural than what you're going to get out of Phoenixcall. Certainly not bad, but it's certainly noticeable. And I call it the Adele test, but generally. But I think Adele is actually one of those vocals that you do notice it. And I think it is actually related here. I think the balanced armature and the microplanar that they use at the high end, it graphs higher than the contribution that you hear in ear. And it's really hard to describe what is going on. If you look at the graph, and we'll look at the graph, it makes not a whole lot of sense. And I wrote ignore there because this part, so this 10K should probably be down here somewhere. So this is elevated a little more than it should, but this looks like a super warm V-shape kind of a banger set, and it's really not that at all. It really, because of the driver size and the driver types, this is not that strong, and this is definitely not. It's kind of relaxed, but it doesn't have that much of a contribution either. And both of those things, the mids and the bass, the way they come together in the mids, I do think it's kind of a weird, slightly off sound that, again, some people dig it, smooth, warm playback. Other people will want a little more technical performance out of it. Tips, and it kind of relates to what I just talked about. I do like the Tang Sakai by Tangzu. I think those tips that came with Fudu didn't actually work all that well for me on Fudu. I think for the reason I didn't like them on Voodoo. They bleed away some of the bass, and I think that actually works out quite well here. It makes your mids a little bit cleaner, and it just works here for me in general. I thought those actually worked a little better than the stock tips. On the food scale, like we talked about, this one will be closer to comfort style food, warm and smooth, especially at lower volume. It really doesn't have any edge to it. It's that warm and smooth style playback. On a track scale, and I think this is the second bit that makes it a little more difficult, it does everything okay, but it's really the master of none. It's really hard to find the sweet spot on this one. And I think that's where even sets like the last one I reviewed was Rinko. I think Rinko may not have had the greatest mids. It may not have even been that, I think it's less natural than this set, but it did a couple of things really well, and it was a really banger V-shaped set. It leaned right into that style of music, and this one sort of takes this middle of the road approach, and it does everything okay, but what genres of music fit well with it, whose voices sound better, male or female, bands, instruments, electronic music. I had a really hard time figuring out what actually plays well here. I think they all generally sound okay. Technicals, I think this is another hybrid that slanting warmer. This one slanted warmer, quite a bit warmer on this one, and it's just not technically pushed either. If you're looking for details and resolution, it's not quite there. This is one you're going to pick up for this style of sound as opposed to details or resolution or note definition. This is another one that's not really pushing in that direction. Sound is I would call it a warm V. Bass, I do think that 7mm, as I was talking about. So in ear, it won't be as huge as a graph, like we just looked at. That graph was quite large for a bass shelf. Tip rolling should really get you in the zone of where you like it, either a little bit more or a little bit less. I think it actually responds quite well, but it's still going to be boosted and it's still going to be full sounding bass. It does reach down far enough into the sub bass. Good, and it actually does pretty well for a smaller driver. Like in general, I think they did pretty well on the 7mm driver. I think it is capable and doesn't really show some of the microdynamic driver faults or limitations. I think they did quite a good job. I think it does resemble a V-shape, though, and if you turn it up to hear a little bit more bass, it's actually going to turn up the upper mids as well, and you're going to end up with kind of an upper mid spiciness there too. At lower volumes, it sounds a little more balanced, and as you push it, it definitely takes on a little bit more of that V-shaped sound to it. Mids, and again, I think this is the hardest part about this set is what happened into the mids and how it didn't really lean into something else. If you're not going to do perfect, beautiful mids, then it helps to have something to fall back on. Great bass, super impactful bass, super treble, super great on electronic music. It helps to have something else when the mids aren't as forward and as detailed, and the resolution isn't right there. And I think that's where this one kind of fell into the V-shaped hole of they kind of come off as a bit recessed, like you would expect on a V-shaped set, but it really kind of struggled hearing the three drivers come together. I think the recipe for success here, what was supposed to be set up in the bass and what was supposed to be set up through the balanced armatures and the microplanar, doesn't necessarily get reflected into the mids. I think on the surface, it actually does sound okay. I think the playback is actually pretty good. I think Adele kind of sounds like Adele when you listen to Adele pushing her voice and the dynamic range. I think that's where it sounds a bit off, but, it sounds about like Adele. It's just not the best Adele that I've ever heard, and probably not the one that I've heard at this price point. And then when you A/B it with another set, maybe in the same price range, maybe another hybrid, I think this is another set where you realize what's missing and what's not quite as resolved and what's not quite as dynamic. And I think on its own, I will kind of stand by it. It actually does sound okay, and it sounds kind of solid okay. It's just when you listen to it against something else, and then you start to hear how they could have done things differently and how there could have been more contribution in the treble and how all that could have made the mids a little bit more energetic or maybe a little bit more forward, a little bit more resolving. I think that's kind of where I have a nitpick with it. And I think the other side of it, it's pretty good for V-shaped. Like I said, there is some recession there, and I think it's to be expected. but you do get kind of a smooth playback, no fatigue points. It's not thin, it's not bright, it's very much okay, middle of the road, right in the middle, the general appealing style. I think they did that pretty well. If you're chasing details and resolution and sparkles, it's really not tuned in that way. Treble, again, I think most people will appreciate that smooth, relaxed, no sibilance, decent extension. But again, it's kind of stacked lower, and you can it's a really interesting graph, and it doesn't sound so much like it, but rising earlier here, and that's only about, it actually is 10 dB. So it rises a bit earlier, dips a little bit, rises, dips, and then it dips off here. How that lands on your music and your tracks is a little bit more inconsistent, and I think generally it's non-fatiguing, and they nailed that right, but it's really harder to hear the upper bit of it. You don't really get a sense of air and space, and there's not really an edge to anything. It doesn't sound like balanced armatures. It doesn't sound like planar. There's not a ton of detail there. I think the planarness isn't obvious on this set. And again, I think when you hear the three drivers together, they sound good as one, but not necessarily shining in the areas that I would expect in a hybrid. So where you notice solid playback, I would say it's not quite the experience. I think it's solid playback, but as far as filling your head with music and imaging and big space, I don't think it necessarily goes there. And that leads to stage. I think the upper treble doesn't translate into much projection here. Often it sounds really in your head, and it can sound a little bit wide, but mostly it kind of gravitates towards in your head. Same on the depth. I think that upper mid, dominant bit to it, just harder to get depth, harder to get a 3D-ness out of the vocals and the mids. Layering and imaging are kind of okay, considering the warm style of tuning. That could have been a lot worse, but I do think the way they did the separation of the drivers and the tubes, and I think all of that was definitely in the right design and definitely contributes there. But yeah, that is what I got on Phoenixcall. So again, thank you guys for tuning in, and I will see you next time.